I retired at 63 and bought a lake house in northern Minnesota so I could finally hear myself think. I'd been there exactly 24 hours when my son-in-law called and told me his parents were moving in. He didn't ask, he informed me. That was his first mistake. My name is Leonard Whitfield, 37 years as a structural engineer. I know how things fail. I also know how to build something that won't. The day I signed the papers, I sat across from Patricia Aldridge in her office and wrote my name on every document with the same steady hand I'd used on 37 years of load calculations. $220,000. Every dollar came from brown bag lunches eaten at my desk, skipped vacations, and Saturday mornings spent working while everyone else slept in. Patricia shook my hand and said I was now the owner of one of the finest properties on Lake Vermilion. I thanked her, collected the keys, and felt them solid in my palm the whole drive north. The roads got narrower and quieter the further I went. Highway turned into county road turned into gravel. Cell service dropped from 4 bars down to 1 flickering signal. I stopped at a bait shop outside of Tower and picked up coffee, eggs, bread, and butter. The woman at the register asked if I was visiting. Living, I told her. She smiled like I'd said the right thing. When the lake finally came through the trees, I pulled over and cut the engine. A great blue heron was standing at the water's edge, still as a fence post. The only sounds were wind in the pines and water against the shore. I sat there for 5 minutes just breathing. No car alarms, no jackhammers, no neighbor's TV bleeding through the wall. Just quiet, real quiet. The kind you forget exists after 30 years in the city. The cabin was exactly what the photos promised. Cedar logs, stone fireplace climbing the north wall, wide windows facing the lake. 3 bedrooms that felt like a luxury after decades in city apartments. I unpacked the way I always approached a new project, methodically, deliberately. Everything in its proper place. Tools hung on the pegboard in the garage. Books arranged on the built-in shelves. Coffee maker on the counter where the morning light would hit it first. By sunset, I had the place set up. I made coffee too late in the afternoon to be smart about it. Carried a mug out to the Adirondack chair on the dock and watched loons move across the water. I called Diane to let her know I'd made it. She sounded genuinely happy for me, said I deserved it. We talked for 20 minutes about easy things. Her 3rd graders, whether she was going to plant a garden this summer, how Gareth had been putting in long hours at the real estate firm. Normal conversation. The kind you have when nothing is wrong. That was day 1. On day 2, Gareth called. I didn't recognize the number at first. I answered thinking it might be the township office following up on paperwork. Leonard, his voice had a specific tone I'd come to recognize over 6 years of him being married to my daughter. The tone that meant he'd already made a decision and was notifying me of it. I wanted to give you a heads up about my parents. Their situation fell through and they need somewhere to stay for a few months. Diane and I talked it over and the cabin is the obvious solution. 3 bedrooms, you're 1 person. It's practical. I set down my coffee. You talked it over. I said with who? Diane and I? She thinks it makes sense. Gareth, I signed those papers yesterday. Right, which is why the timing works. The place is sitting empty most of the time anyway. There was a pause and then his voice shifted slightly. My dad has some health issues. They need somewhere quiet and clean. You're not using all that space. And honestly, if you've got a problem with it, you should think about selling and coming back to Chicago where you can actually be useful to the family. He hung up before I could respond. I sat on the dock for a long time after that. The heron was still there, hadn't moved from its spot at the water's edge. Here's the thing about being an engineer for 37 years. You don't react to a problem, you assess it. You identify the variables, you account for failure points, and you design a solution that holds. I went inside, made a fresh pot of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a mechanical pencil, and started writing. I didn't sleep much that night. That was fine. I had work to do. First thing the next morning I made 3 phone calls. The first was to the Lake Vermilion Township office. I asked about regulations for long-term occupants and what was required to register additional residents on a property. The clerk explained the rules patiently. Any occupant staying longer than 30 days needed to be registered for emergency purposes, fire response, medical. I asked her to repeat the exact wording twice and wrote it down word for word. The second call was to Roger Stanton, my insurance agent of 28 years. Roger, I need to go over the policy on my new property, specifically the liability coverage and anything related to unregistered occupants. Roger walked me through it carefully. My policy covered me as the sole resident. Additional occupants required advance notification. Unauthorized long-term guests could void my coverage entirely. He asked why I was asking. I told him I was being thorough. He laughed and said I was the most careful man he knew. The third call was to Kathleen Mercer. Kathleen Mercer was the only attorney in the area worth talking to. Her office was in tower above a hardware store with a view of the parking lot and a wall of filing cabinets that looked like they'd been there since the 1980s. She was around 44, direct in the way that people who grow up in small northern towns tend to be. No small talk, no preamble. I explained the situation without emotion. Facts only. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Mr. Whitfield, you have every legal right to refuse entry to anyone you choose. This is your property. You have no obligation to house your son-in-law's parents." I asked what happened if they showed up anyway. "If they refuse to leave after you've clearly asked them to go, that's trespassing. You call the sheriff." I nodded. I asked her what she would recommend beyond that. She pulled out a legal pad. "Document everything, every call, every message, every conversation. If they arrive and won't leave, give them a clear verbal request first. Then written notice if needed. If they still won't go, we escalate." She paused. "I'd also suggest you have something ready before they arrive, not after." I hired her on the spot, $2,000 retainer. I wrote the check without hesitating. On the drive back, I stopped at Carl Briggs' hardware store in Tower. Carl was a weathered man who knew every item in his store by location and didn't waste words. I told him I wanted wildlife cameras to monitor deer activity near the property. He walked me straight to the right shelf. Motion-activated night vision cellular connectivity sends images directly to your phone. He mentioned that a lot of folks use them for security too. I bought 3 units and a motion-activated light for the driveway. $412 cash. I kept the receipt. I installed all 3 cameras myself the next morning. One on the driveway approach tucked into the branches of a pine tree about 8 feet up. One mounted under the garage eave facing the front door. One covering the dock and the boathouse from the corner of the cabin. I tested each one, adjusted the angles, confirmed the cellular connection, and checked that the timestamps were syncing correctly to my phone. Clean sightlines, overlapping fields of view, full coverage. 37 years of structural engineering. I knew how to build something that wouldn't have gaps. I also knew something else. Gareth worked in real estate. He understood property values. He knew exactly what that cabin on Lake Vermilion was worth, and he had decided somewhere along the way that he had a claim to it. The call about his parents moving in wasn't about his parents. It was about getting a foot in the door. I'd seen that kind of calculation before, just never from someone sitting at my own dinner table. I thought about Diane. My daughter had been teaching 3rd grade for 9 years. She loved her kids, called me every Sunday without fail for most of her 20s, and had a laugh that filled whatever room she was in. Somewhere in the last few years, those Sunday calls had gotten shorter and further apart. I'd noticed it and told myself it was just what happened when people got busy with their own lives. I wasn't so sure about that anymore. The Friday Earl and Pauline Nolan were supposed to arrive. I was on the dock reading when my phone buzzed with a camera alert. I pulled up the live feed. A rental car was coming up the gravel road. I watched it stop in front of the cabin. 2 people got out. Earl Nolan, late 60s, looked around with the expression of a man pricing everything in his field of vision. Pauline Nolan stood next to him, swatted at something in the air, and made a face at the tree line. I met them on the porch. "Earl, Pauline." I kept my voice level. "I wasn't expecting you." Earl's handshake was brief and businesslike. "Gareth said you'd be here. Sorry about the mix-up at the airport. We went ahead and rented a car." There was no mix-up. I never agreed to pick you up, and I never agreed to have you stay here. Pauline's expression went tight immediately. "Gareth said this was arranged. Gareth doesn't own this property, I do, and I'm telling you directly that you're not staying here." Earl stepped forward. His voice shifted into a register I recognized right away, the tone of a man who had spent his whole life using it to get what he wanted. "Now look, Leonard, let's be reasonable here. We're family. You've got 3 bedrooms and you're one person in all this space. It's not right to refuse when people need help." I let him finish. "Selfish," I said. "I worked 37 years for this place. I ate lunch at my desk while everyone else went out. I missed birthdays, I missed holidays. I earned every square foot of this property, and you're standing on my porch calling me selfish for not handing it over to people I've met a handful of times." Earl's face went red. "Gareth told us you might be difficult about this. Apparently Gareth tells people a lot of things. There's a resort about 40 minutes from here, nice place on the water. I'd recommend it. Please leave my property." "We're not leaving," Earl said. "We drove 3 hours from Duluth. We have just as much right to be here as you do. You have no rights here. I own this property, you don't. If you won't leave, I'll call the sheriff and have you removed for trespassing." Pauline grabbed Earl's arm. "Let's just go. We'll call Gareth and sort this out." They walked back to the rental car, still arguing with each other. I watched them pull down the driveway and disappear into the tree line. Then I went inside and pulled up the camera footage on my laptop. Every word, every expression, every second of it timestamped and saved. The phone started ringing within the hour. Gareth called twice within the first hour. I let both go to voicemail. The first message was controlled, annoyed. The second one was not. It ended with, "You think you can humiliate my parents and there won't be consequences, Leonard. We'll see about that." I saved both messages and forwarded them to Kathleen. Diana called that evening. Her voice had the careful, measured quality of someone who had been coached on what to say. She told me I was being unreasonable. That Gareth's parents were good people who just needed a little help. That I had more space than I needed and family was supposed to mean something. I listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, I asked her one question. "Did Gareth tell you to call me, or did you decide to on your own?" A long pause, then, "That's not fair. I know, honey. I love you. But that's not an answer." She hung up. I sat on the dock until it got dark, listening to the loons, thinking about my daughter and how long it had been since I'd heard her laugh the way she used to. 3 weeks passed. Quiet weeks, but I knew better than to read anything into that. Gareth was not the type to drop something. He was the type to regroup. I used those 3 weeks the same way I'd used every difficult stretch in my career. I gathered information. I contacted Beverly Holt, a private investigator in Minneapolis that Kathleen had recommended. $300 for a basic background check on Earl and Pauline Nolan and a general financial overview of Gareth's situation. Beverly was efficient and didn't editorialize. The report came back in 4 days. Earl Nolan had declared bankruptcy 18 months ago, a restaurant investment that had been bleeding money for years before it finally collapsed, leaving behind a civil judgment of $75,000 against him from a business partner. The apartment that Gareth had described to me as needing renovation had not been renovated. It had been foreclosed. Earl and Pauline had been living with Gareth and Diane for 5 months, not the few weeks anyone had implied. Beverly called me personally to deliver one more detail. "There are financial transfers from a joint account belonging to your daughter and son-in-law," she said, "to accounts in Earl Nolan's name. Over the past 10 months, I'm counting approximately $48,000. I sat down at the kitchen table. Can you document all of it? Already done? Report's coming to you today." I printed the report when it arrived and added it to the folder I had been building since day 3. Then I went to the dock and sat there for a long time. $48,000, that was Diane's money too. Whatever she and Gareth had been saving together, whatever plans they'd had, that money was gone and she almost certainly did not know the full picture. Then, on a Thursday afternoon about 4 weeks after the confrontation with Earl and Pauline, my camera alert went off while I was in Duluth for a routine checkup. I was sitting in the waiting room when my phone buzzed. I opened the live feed. Gareth was walking through my cabin with 2 people I had never seen before. A man and a woman, both in their 40s, both looking around with the particular attentiveness of people who are deciding whether to spend money on something. The man had a clipboard. The woman was measuring the width of the main window with her hand, the way people do when they're thinking about furniture. Gareth was talking, gesturing toward the lake view, pointing at the fireplace. I watched the entire thing. 22 minutes, every second time-stamped. He was already showing the property to buyers. I drove back to the cabin in a state of complete clarity. This was no longer about his parents needing a place to stay. It had probably never been about that. This was about a man who had looked at something his father-in-law had spent a lifetime earning and decided it belonged to him. The parents were a way to get occupants established on the property. Occupants who would make it complicated to sell, who could be used as leverage, who would give Gareth time to maneuver. I called Kathleen from the car. She listened to everything without interrupting, the same way she had the first time. When I finished, she said, "Forward me the footage tonight." All of it. Then she said, "This changes things, Leonard. He just handed us something significant." I asked her what she meant. "He showed buyers through your property without your knowledge or consent. That's a real problem for him professionally and legally. We're going to use it." That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a second cup of coffee I didn't need and thought about how to approach what I knew I had to do next. I had a folder full of documentation. I had footage. I had a lawyer who knew exactly what to do with all of it. What I didn't have yet was Diane. Not because I was protecting her from the truth. I had never been that kind of father, and I wasn't going to start now. I needed to give her the truth in the right way, at the right time, without Gareth in the room controlling the conversation. If I called her at home and he was there, he would manage whatever happened next. He was good at that. I needed to see her alone. I called her the following morning and asked if she could meet me in Duluth on Saturday, just her. I said I had something important I needed to share with her in person. She went quiet for a moment, then she said she would be there. We met at a diner near the Duluth harbor on a gray Saturday morning. Diane was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the drive up. the kind of tired that settles into a person over months, not overnight. I sat down across from her and ordered coffee. We talked about small things for a few minutes. Her students, the weather, whether the walleye had been running. She was waiting for me to get to the point, and we both knew it. I slid the folder across the table without saying anything. She opened it slowly. The first pages were Beverly's summary of Earl's bankruptcy, the judgment, the foreclosure on the apartment. I watched her face as she read. She didn't say anything. She turned to the bank transfer records. The documentation of $48,000 moved from her joint account with Gareth into accounts under Earl Nolan's name over 10 months. Her jaw tightened, but she kept reading. Then she got to the last section, the camera footage printouts with timestamps. Gareth walking two strangers through my cabin. The man with the clipboard, the woman measuring the window. 22 minutes on a Thursday afternoon while I was at a medical appointment in Duluth. She set the papers down and stared at the table. He told me the transfers were an investment, she said. Her voice was quiet and flat. A business opportunity his dad had found. He said they'd see returns within a year. There was no investment, Diane. That money went directly into your father-in-law's personal accounts to cover his debts. He said the apartment renovation was just taking longer than the contractor promised. The apartment was foreclosed 6 months before Gareth called me about the cabin. His parents have been living with you for 5 months, not a few weeks. She looked out the window at the harbor for a long time. A container ship was moving slowly along the far shore, heading toward the lift bridge. He was showing buyers your house, she said. Yes, while you were at the doctor, yes. She pressed her hands flat on the table. I could see her working through it. The way you do when the thing in front of you is too large to take in all at once and you have to process it piece by piece. I didn't rush her. This was her marriage, her money, her father's house. She was entitled to take whatever time she needed. How long have you known? She asked. I've been building the documentation for about 4 weeks. I wanted to have everything confirmed before I said a word to you. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I needed you to see it all at once with nothing missing. If I'd come to you with half of it, Gareth would have had time to construct an explanation for the other half. He's good at that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he is good at that. She cried for a little while. I let her. I didn't try to tell her it was going to be fine or that everything happened for a reason. I just sat there and let her feel what she was feeling. After a few minutes, she straightened up, wiped her face with a napkin, and asked me what she needed to do. That was my daughter. That had always been my daughter. I told her to call a family law attorney before she went home, not to say anything to Gareth yet, to make sure she had independent legal advice before any conversation with him about what she'd learned. She nodded and wrote down the name Kathleen had already given me. Kathleen sent a formal cease and desist letter to Gareth's attorney the following week. It documented the unauthorized property showing the fraudulent occupancy arrangement and the financial transfers, and it made clear that any further attempts to access or encumber the property would result in immediate legal action. Gareth's response was to escalate. His attorney sent a letter back claiming that some of the funds transferred to Earl were actually loans that had passed through Gareth to me, money I supposedly owed the family for unspecified support over the years. Based on this fiction, the letter claimed Gareth held a partial ownership interest in the cabin and intended to assert that interest in court. It was fabricated from start to finish, but his attorney was willing to file it, and filing it would mean months of legal proceedings designed to cost me time and money until I gave up. Around the same time, a letter arrived from the Minnesota Department of Human Services. An anonymous complaint had been filed claiming I was showing signs of cognitive decline and living in unsafe conditions. The letter requested a home visit to assess my situation. I called Kathleen immediately. She told me this was a known tactic, that family members sometimes used adult protective services as a pressure tool against elderly relatives who wouldn't cooperate. She told me to stay calm, let the investigation proceed, and document everything. I called Beverly Holt next and asked her to expand the scope of her work to include Gareth's full financial picture, employment history, and any prior legal activity. This is escalating, she said. I know, I said. So am I. Beverly's second report arrived 8 days later. It was thorough in the way that only bad news tends to be. Gareth had 3 active complaints filed against him with the Minnesota Department of Commerce, which licenses real estate agents. 2 were from clients who claimed he had misrepresented property values. The third was from a seller who said Gareth had collected a deposit and failed to disclose a known structural issue. None had resulted in formal discipline yet, but they were on record. More importantly, Beverly had found 2 additional bank accounts in Gareth's name that Diane did not know existed. Between them, another $31,000 had moved through over the past 14 months. Some of it traced back to the joint account. Some of it came from a line of credit opened in Diane's name without her knowledge. I read that last part twice. A line of credit in Diane's name, opened without her knowledge. That was not a man trying to help his parents through a hard stretch. That was a man systematically dismantling his wife's financial life while keeping her too busy and too confused to notice. I sent the report to Kathleen the same evening. A social worker named Shirley Pond knocked on my cabin door 2 days later. She was professional and straightforward, introduced herself clearly, explained the nature of the complaint, and asked if she could come in. I gave her a full tour of the property, organized files on the desk, tools properly stored in the garage, pantry stocked, nothing out of place. I made coffee and answered every question she asked clearly and directly. When she asked whether there was any family conflict that might have prompted the report, I told her exactly what had happened and gave her copies of the relevant documentation. Shirley took notes without reacting. Before she left, she told me that the complaint contained specific details about my daily routine that suggested the filer had recent first-hand knowledge of the property, and that it had been submitted anonymously from an IP address registered to a Chicago internet provider. Gareth had overplayed his hand. The investigation closed 12 days later. Finding unfounded. The same week Shirley's report came through, Diane called Gareth's attorney directly. She told him that if Gareth proceeded with the fabricated ownership claim against my property, she would provide full testimony about every fraudulent transfer, every hidden account, the forged line of credit, and the 22 minutes of time-stamped footage showing her husband conducting an unauthorized property showing at her father's home. Gareth's attorney dropped him as a client the following day. Diane filed for divorce in November. She and her daughter came to stay at the cabin through most of December while the legal process got underway. The first morning they were there, I made pancakes and we ate at the table by the window while snow came down on the lake. My granddaughter was 4 years old and wanted to know if the fish could see the snow falling through the ice. I told her we would find out in the spring. The divorce finalized the following April. Gareth's next attorney tried 3 additional legal angles over the course of those months. All 3 collapsed once Diane's forensic accountant completed his review. The total financial damage Gareth had done came to just under $80,000 when everything was counted. Earl and Pauline moved out of Gareth's place when the proceedings started and found somewhere else to land. I heard through Kathleen that they had moved in with a relative in Wisconsin. On the first warm Saturday in May, I was on the dock with my coffee when Diane and her daughter came walking down the path from the cabin. My granddaughter had a child-sized fishing rod I had ordered back in February and kept in the closet, still in the packaging, waiting. She's been asking about it every single day, Diane said. We spent the whole afternoon out there. I showed her how to bait the hook, how to cast without tangling the line, how to watch the water and wait. She was not particularly good at it. She got the line caught in itself twice and dropped a worm once, and laughed both times like it was the funniest thing that had ever happened. Then she asked to try again. Just before sunset, the loon started calling across the water. My granddaughter looked up from her rod with wide eyes.
Grandpa, what's that sound?
That's a loon, I said. They live here. She thought about it for a second. Do they know it's their house? I looked out at the lake. Yeah, I said, they know. Gareth had wanted to sell this place. He had stood in my living room with strangers and a clipboard and believed he had it figured out. Instead, my granddaughter was learning to fish off the dock where I had sat the night everything started, and the loons were calling the same as they always had. I worked 37 years for this. I said no when everyone expected yes. I chose truth over easy silence. And I protected what was mine, not just the property, but my daughter and the life I had built. If someone in your life is telling you that what you earn does not belong to you, that standing your ground makes you selfish, that keeping what you worked for is somehow unkind, do not believe them. Document everything. Get a lawyer, and do not move. If this story hit close to home, leave a comment below. I read everyone, and if you know someone who needs to hear it, share it with them.